Welcome to the Pastor's Podcast. Pastor Scott here again with Pastor Jim.
Yes.
Hey, Jim.
Hi, Scott.
How's your week going?
It's confused so far. How's yours?
Confused. Well, now that you mention it, I'm not sure that's how I would have described it, but now I really resonate with that.
Many of my weeks are confused. I'm confused about that. I don't quite know why.
Well, it's Wednesday. We're recording this on a
Yes.
on a Wednesday.
Midweek. Yep.
Just had Halloween.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm dating this. I probably shouldn't date it, but Halloween on a Monday was a bummer.
How so?
It doesn't belong on a Monday night.
Oh, I see.
Like it belongs on a Saturday, on a Friday.
Good point. Yeah.
Like you get through the weekend, and then there's like after a Monday, there's no time to set up. There's no time to get ready. There's no time to recover. You just I don't know. Maybe Halloween's a little bit intense for me. Then I need to set up and recover. But
and you got school kids on Tuesday
exactly.
who are sugared out, and they're also we're up to midnight. Yes, you're good point.
Of all the things that we've made national holidays,
yeah, yes.
The fact that we haven't figured this out with the night that every kid goes out and gets sugared up super late.
Yep.
Anyways.
Oh, no, that's what we do in America. We screw everything up, but we have fun doing it.
That's
a great time.
Okay, well, that might be our lead-in to Cornerstone History.
Yes, indeed.
The history of America and Cornerstone History. So as we've been doing, this is our fourth now installment in Cornerstone History, and it's been a while since we've had an opportunity to talk about this, but we're going to be diving into a bit of a new era. We're going to be covering it over a few different episodes. But before we do that, I want to stop and look back at the previous era, because we spent the last episode talking about Dr. Thomas.
Yes.
And the kind of the era of the life of the church when he was pastoring here. And during that time, I mean, he was here a long time. Was it 30 years?
Yes.
Okay. And he left in
69, I think. 77.
77.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
77.
So he left in 77. And so, but before we move on to what came after that, I know we had talked about this a little bit. It might be helpful to just look back and consider, where was the church at that point?
Mm-hmm.
What were the characteristics of the church, and kind of coming out of that time, that season, that era in the church? What were things like?
I think I'm wrong about the date. I think it was before that. Am I right? 77? No, that's right.
That's what I had. That's what I had in our previous conversation.
Right.
I think that's what I had.
Okay. I'm getting confused at my prior confusion.
Because it was 2 years, and then Huber came in 79.
79.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right,
Okay.
Right. I was thinking it came in. Yes, you're right. Right. Okay. All right, what's your question again?
So 1977.
Yes.
Where's the church at the end of this era, the Thomas era? What are things? What's the community like? What's the church like?
It's been a long season for the church. Dr. Thomas, the whole aftermath of World War II, the church has been through a long series. I mean, we look at our country, it's the same thing, right? The Great Depression followed by a World War. And then in the 50s, the communist scare, Korea, and people trying very hard to make life as normal as they can, and especially having kids, which meant baby boomers, what we call now, looking back in history, this huge ballooning of the number of children. And I was part of that. And I remember in my high school, they had 2 different schedules because there were so many kids. And even later, a 3rd schedule was added. There were just kids everywhere. And so that factored in as well. But that was what was going on at that time. And those kids had grown up and become, like young people in their 20s and were entering the workforce and entering churches. And that was the beginning. Did
the sexual revolution of the 60s, I mean, it seems to me
Well, I missed it, but
go ahead. But from what I know about Dr. Thomas,
yes,
he's a pretty straight-laced guy.
Yes.
Very like kind of military style.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't seem to me like he would have jived with the kind of hippie counterculture, or even maybe the Jesus culture. Did those two like overlap? Did they engage at all? Did the Jesus movement here have any presence here at the church, or were those two kind of separate things?
They were separate things, and yeah, it didn't. It really did not. I wasn't here for that, but as I understand it, there were people who wanted to change the way the church dealt with students on campus and with young people to try to incorporate that, and the leadership of the church was backing away from that. There were other Christian movements among college students, and some of those were fostered by churches like this one that were more conservative, but that was a whole genre of strong movements of various types, and Christians were not, immune from that. But it felt, as I understood it, I was not here at the time, but as I understood it, it felt like that was over the top. It was too much. It was too emotional. It wasn't intellectual enough. It wasn't clear enough on what you needed to do, and it was too focused on other factors that were coming into play on a large scale. Music, all kinds of drugs beginning to show up on campuses, and a large number of things. And in those days, it was there was a strong, I think, division in the country at large, so that you had movements that were banned on campuses, just like they were banned in churches, because the campuses too were more conservative than the younger generation coming up thought was appropriate for them.
And so, I mean, the sense I get was that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. The sense I get is that there was this, the church grew and multiplied and sent out missionaries, and the Lord was doing some incredible things in it. As far as it related to the larger culture, though, and even some of the culture in the broader church, though, it resisted a lot of those changes.
Yes.
And was, I would imagine, coming out of this time through the 70s into the late 70s, was kind of a standing as a bulwark of the old way of doing things, both in our kind of ecclesiologically, but also in relation to the Jesus movement, the different movements out there theologically, but also culturally, and like we've talked about in response to the civil rights movement, even it was not the church community here wasn't leading the way of change.
No, it was trying to lead its own way of change, I guess I'd say. But this goes back. You can think back to, like, look at the movies that came out in the 40s, and then in the late 40s they began to change and became more focused on, like, desperate people, fallen people, a lot of tragic kinds of movies made. The music began to change. The changes were culture wide, and many, not just churches, but many parts of the society resisted those, and there began to be this divide between the younger and the older generations, not just in faith, but in across the country.
Okay, so 1977.
Yeah,
Dr. Thomas retires.
Right,
and he retires, at least to my understanding, without a clear kind of succession plan. Like, he didn't hand it over to the second in command.
No.
Here. He just retires.
And
the church goes through a couple of year process of pastoral search.
Yes.
Is that?
Correct. Yes, that's correct.
Okay. How would you describe, I mean, we've done much, but how would you describe the the makeup or attitude of the church in those 2 years? In this, what was their sense of their self-identity, and what were they looking for in the next pastor?
Yeah, there was a sense of sort of a defensiveness because within the Christian, whatever you call it, community or world, there were all kinds of different pastors who had all kinds of different views on what the Bible said, what life was like, what our culture was. And so they were looking for someone who would follow in the same stream, the same mindset as Dr. Thomas.
Okay.
And there were people out there like that. And to some extent, George Huber was one of those people. He didn't quite hold with Dr. Thomas, but he highly revered him and respected him. So they actually were able to achieve their desired goal, but there was a long look because it was harder to find those people than it had been in the past.
What? All right. So it gives me two questions. One is, it's interesting to me. Well, maybe an observation and a question. It's interesting to me to remember that they had come through. Not only were these things going on culturally, but they'd also come through in America some really important theological battles as well. I mean, as you were talking, I remember now, this was the time where it was the battle for inerrancy. Yeah. Right? Where the Bible, the truth of the Bible was being actively attacked in a way that it hadn't before in kind of in our modern culture. Yes. And Dr. Thomas was trying to hold fast to the fact that the Bible is true. Yes. The Bible as revealed is true. And that wasn't where the church was going to end up on that question, wasn't a sure thing.
That's correct. And there was, I mean, that was the headliner in some sense. So the first question asked of any candidate was, do you believe the Bible is the Word of God? Literally. And there were questions about people who wanted to hem and haw a bit on that. Where do we fit them in? Do we want somebody who's straight line on this, or do we want somebody who maybe understands but maybe has some variation on that? And as I understand it, they were really looking for somebody who was right down the very narrow road. Yeah, it was very hard to find.
Yeah, it must have been. Okay, so this leads to my question, an observation and a question, but. Part of this is just really unfamiliar ecclesiology, even to me, in my life and experience. With all of the leaders and missionaries and future pastors that got raised up here, how is there not somebody else here that could do that? Well, or is that just not how it worked? Like, what am I missing?
There were. I think one of the changes that I see is that there were not a lot of staff people in those days. There might have been one other part-time associate pastor or something like that. But most churches did not have large staffs. They had a few people that got paid, like the janitor. But usually there was one pastor who was the main pastor, and they could afford his salary, but they weren't sure they could afford everybody else's, so there weren't any assistant pastors. Until fairly late in that time. Now, there were starting to be, but my understanding is that the pastors who were here under Dr. Thomas were all volunteer. They came to learn from him, and they supported themselves somehow, or their wives worked, or some other thing that they would do, because the people who got paid were him, the janitor, and the organist, and
I imagine they were probably looking at that point too for somebody with experience, having been in that type of position. Yes. And if there was only one of those types of positions here, then nobody else could have been.
That's exactly it. Okay. Yeah. So there was a pastor. That was your pastor.
So they went through this 2-year pastoral search and called George Huber.
That's correct.
Who's George Huber? Tell me about this.
He was an interesting guy. He was a professional singer.
He was?
Yes.
Okay.
He had a wonderful voice. And so he sang, he's a strong Christian, very smart man. who, as part of his growth, put himself through seminary to kind of know what he was singing about. And a very, very smart man. Got his PhD and then was supporting his family and himself by singing. But at that point, there weren't that many places for a professional Christian singer to sing and make good money at it. Mm-hmm. And he gradually drifted into being a pastor because that's how he could make a living. And wound up looking for a church and was contacted by somebody here. I don't know who, but somebody heard about him and called him.
Okay, so I just mentioned the importance of experience. So maybe I'm just making assumptions here. So he had not previously been a pastor.
He had done some pastoral work.
Okay.
And he there was a point in his life, he said, where he in smaller churches he would both preach and sing, and he kind of did that as a part of how he explained his music, or the music explained the scriptures. And so he felt like he had some background with that. But yeah, he had some experience, but not a lot. He had not been that long in the pastorate.
Okay. So I know we've talked about this, and maybe even to show people a little bit about where we're going. Over the course of the next few decades, there were a successive number of 3 different pastors that map loosely onto the next 3 decades.
Yeah.
Right? The 80s, the 90s, and what are we calling
Hundreds.
it? The aughts.
The aughts.
The 2000s. Okay, so Dr. Huber mapped, he was called here in 1979, was here until the late 80s, or 1990, was that correct?
Let's see. He came in 79, was here till 90.
Okay.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, so basically the decade of the 80s.
Yes.
So maybe before we get back to him or some of the dynamics going on there, what was West LA like in the 80s? Like what was this community like during that decade?
It was fairly liberal. It was fairly wild. It was fairly fun. That was, my wife and I were living out here at that time, and it was a great place to be. You could walk down. We talk about the promenade in Santa Monica, which was there had been there not that long at that point. You could walk down there and feel fairly high by the end of your 3-block walk, because there are just so many people out there, smoking marijuana or doing something. But and the UCLA campus was nearby, which is kind of ultra liberal ground zero. And the West Side itself had a political stance toward I think a very liberal sense of culture and governance. So this church was kind of an outpost in the midst of that. It was an odd place. The next closest conservative church was out in the valley, I believe, in those days. So the fact that it stayed that way, it became sort of isolated. It became sort of stuck in a way that the people coming here didn't like the culture around them, but they liked the church. And they liked their church fellowship. And to some extent, the church fellowship had congealed. So they'd come together. They were much more close to each other. And I think that's one of the reasons why the church wasn't growing and it wasn't attracting newer, younger people into it. It was because they didn't exactly close the doors, but unless your politics were right, you weren't really welcome.
Interesting. So in the through the 80s, did the membership of the church here stay essentially the same? Did it decline slightly? Like, you said it didn't grow.
It didn't grow. It did decline slightly. It very much was the same group of people.
Okay.
Yeah. And only toward the end of that era, there began to be young people who were conservative in their politics and their faith who began to come into the church. There were some. It wasn't it was a trickle, not a flood, but there were some who came in, but not many.
And so during the 80s, I mean, would you say that the vast majority of people here were they were a continuation of those that were here under Dr. Thomas?
They've been here a long time, yeah.
They've been here a long time.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. What what were some of the dynamics of maybe church life or even spiritual life during those years for those people?
The event, the get-togethers, the events that happened here were for the people here. They weren't outreaches. Outreaches generally failed. When we came, my wife and I, for the first time, everybody was shocked to see us, and we heard over and over again, "Thank goodness you come. You're the first young people we've seen coming in a long time." And even the first person who met us at the door said, "Oh my gosh, you're coming to church. We're conservative here, you know." And I had no idea what that meant.
Wait. They said that to you in their greeting?
Yeah, that's right. I just want to make sure he didn't cause a scene, I think, storming out or something. I don't know. I don't know what they expected, but and we got that a lot. And people would say, are you conservative? And we would say, we don't know. We just became Christians. We don't know what we are. We're just here, and nobody knew quite what to do with this. Dr. Huber was delighted. Delighted to see us. And so the sense I had when I walked in the door was that this was a fairly closed group that would love to see somebody come in who's not in their generation, but that just wasn't happening.
So that's really interesting, because I think one of the things we touched on in the last was the lack of ethnic diversity here, and I'm assuming that given this nature, this continued, but really what you're describing is a distinct and intentional lack of diversity across the different ways, right? Not just an ethnic, but a political kind of life stage. Like there was a congealing homogeny during that season.
Yes, there was, I think, a real desire to have younger people, whatever that meant, somebody younger than them, in the church, but they were looking for the right kind of younger people, and they weren't showing up. We were surprised that there were a few people who were not Caucasian in the room. Not many, but there were some, and we were especially surprised that one family was Japanese, because we just fought a war with them, right? And so we were surprised at them. So there were these little anomalies, but the majority of the congregation that was here were older, from that 40s era, and Caucasian.
Now, so I mean, we can talk about the demographics. We can talk about the kind of holdover and the cultural dynamics. At the same time, this is still. It's still the church.
Yes.
Right? And the Lord is working in different ways in these people. What are, I don't know, in talking with people about that time, were there any things that stood out about ways that the Lord was working during that season in the life of the church?
That's a very good question. No, I'll tell you what my wife and I saw. We both grew up in churches. We knew the Bible. We knew, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. We understood church, but neither of us had been in church in a long time. Basically, my wife stopped going to church when she graduated from high school. They handed her a Bible on the way out the door, which she threw in a trunk and never opened again. I had been part of church life in college. But not really as a believer, really more as a manipulator and exploiter. Cute girls, in those places. So I was looking for dates.
For the record, if you want to hear more, I think we did a testimony podcast.
I think we did.
That retold some of this story, so people can go back and listen to that. But it's quite a journey.
If you do, please don't call me. I lived those days once just to record it, and that's it. No, we I think were peculiarly suited to go in there, because we knew church culture, but we really only went in because we felt compelled by our new faith to be be with other believers. And so we kind of pushed ourselves in the door. And I think that was totally a God thing. I don't think I have a view so much as someone else might of what an impact it made for two people like us to walk in the door. They had seen nobody but themselves for a very long time. And so we were a bit embarrassed by the way people looked at us and talked to us and the attention and all that. It wasn't too long before other people started walking in the door too. So I think part of it was George Huber. I think part of it was the same thing happening to other people that happened to us. Some kind of twist in our culture as we got older that made people think there's got to be something more. But it was a very slow process. So it was only, I remember like 3 years later, something like that, we were able to put together a study group of about 6 of us. So slow going. Yeah. But that was, it seems to me, something God, it was a God thing.
So I want you to tell me a little bit more about Dr. Huber. But before we do that, I'd love to ask, what are some of the other personalities or people that stood out to you during those early years, your first years here, that left an impression on you?
Oh gosh, the thing. I think my wife got the better end of it. I think women came around her very quickly, and she liked that. She liked older women, and felt like they were kind of mothering her in some way. For me, the men were odd. They didn't have the same interests I had. They didn't have any cultural connections to what I was connected to. If we saw a movie, they had never seen it. They, in some ways, they'd never seen a color movie. That's a little exaggeration, perhaps. But I remember going to a breakfast, and it was a men's breakfast, and I looked around, and there was all older men and me, and nobody knew what to talk to me about. I wound up sitting at a table by myself because I think if people would come up and make a brief comment or something like that, but I don't think any of them knew what to say. So the first time somebody showed up who was more my age, and I remember who that was, I grabbed onto him and I said, let's sit together, okay? And just talk. So gradually that was being broken down. But it was a very odd time, and I thought it was a very odd church and a very odd situation. But Dr. Huber was all over us and welcoming and glad to see us, not surprisingly, and very interested in getting us involved, connected into the church very quickly, and put me on the door so that anybody else who came in who was our age would see at least one person their age at the door. It was very weird, but I'm greeting people to the church that I barely know myself. But there I am. So, and it worked. People began to come.
All right, okay. Tell me a little bit more about Dr. Huber, about his ministry, his heart. What that time was.
He had a wonderful heart. His wife was wonderful as well. He had intended to be a professional musician, and he got a PhD in music, and would break into song at the he'd be singing, preaching a sermon, and he'd break into song at some point. But
we could get Brian to do this.
Yeah.
I think we could.
That would be interesting. And everybody was coming.
Matt does it.
Yeah. But Dr. Huber could sing. Sorry, Matt. And he had a beautiful, deep voice, and he just loved to sing. So he was an interesting fellow, but he's a very, very bright guy, and was really looking for people to disciple. He'd preach on Sunday, but he really came alive discipling. And he made a connection with the seminary in Portland, which name
Western
Seminary. And this is the beginning of this whole thing of using a variety of ways to teach people. So, and those days they had videotapes of classes, and they would ship you the videotapes, this big, huge box of videotapes, and you would be looking in, from the back of the room past the students at the teacher, and he'd be talking, and that was a class, and you just were like part of the class. And then he would shut the video off, and then he would talk to us about that, and we would have readings. So that was my beginning of quote, seminary in a very strange kind of distant way. But that's where I began to learn a whole lot. And he had about 6 of us in there at that point. So it was a nice little class. But I think somehow he connected with me. I don't know particularly why, but he really seemed to focus on me and my wife and our spiritual growth. I think it excited him. I think it was for his soul more than for mine that he did that. So I got a lot of attention, and I was working, nearby, and it was very easy to be here for evenings and meetings. So
I'm always interested in how this looks, what discipleship looks like in different eras and in different places, and I think even just the ways that it informs us and can get us out of some of our ruts. So what did that consist of? Like what did discipleship, if Dr. Huber was discipling you during those years, what did that consist of? It consist of watching classes on video and then discussing it. What did that look like?
There was a thing, what was it called? The Navigator 2.7, something or other. There was some kind of very popular program out. And there are several of those. I don't know if there are today or not. I haven't seen any in a long time, but they were packaged programs that you could put together, and you didn't have to have a experienced leader. You just filled in the blanks basically. And so we went through probably 3 of those, and then he tried to start a class where he would meet with us, and that didn't go too well. For a number of reasons, but I think one of them was I think there were only 3 of us in it began. It just like it was too small. Not too long after he'd been here, I think a year or 2, he had to have heart surgery, and so suddenly it was fairly serious. He was out for about 4 more months. I think the entire summer he was gone, and so that caused there was a leadership gap at the top. So that was an issue. We had guest pastors. We had no classes at that point, or no studies. He was not supposed to do anything, but he called my wife and me and said, I want to know how you're doing, so come over and see me, give me a visit. And so he got up and got dressed for the visit, which he wasn't supposed to do, and just just really sweet. But it was a very difficult time with him in this church, trying to get it going again, and then having about 3 months where he was basically flat on his back.
Wow. So during that time in maybe the life of the church and maybe even churches generally, it seems like that 10 or 11 year stint was a fairly long time.
I thought so. I thought it was a very difficult time. More and more people in my age group who were there were critical of him.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because he refused to move the church forward, or change the worship service, or change the way the church is run. He kept the model.
Because the reason he got hired was as a defender of the old guard.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
And so we had 4 boards and 87 commissions and just all kinds of governance over the church, and which is very hard to do because you had to keep appointing people to all those, and some of them had been in those roles for decades, and so young people coming in had no way to get into the church. They were the wrong age group, or even if they were on a committee, they were on there basically as a trainee, even though they may have been in their mid-20s and a lawyer or something like that. There was so it was a transition that was that he knew needed to happen, wanted to do, was being criticized for not making it happen, but all the parameters were in place for it not to happen. Everything worked against it.
Mm. So it wasn't just that there were changes he was resistant to making himself, but was it more him or his leadership, or was it more the system that wasn't set up to
It is the latter.
Change?
Yeah, he very much saw the need to change. And he admitted that, since he was actually of an older generation, it was hard for him to be able to do that. He really needed, so he kept trying to bring in assistant pastors who were younger, but they'd take a look at the church and wouldn't stay. So it was kind of an unsolvable, crushing dilemma, and he was getting the blame for it. And I think that may have been, he already had heart problems, but that may have been why he had to have surgery. I think he was being worn out by the criticism and the impatience with the church, with his leadership. So it was a very difficult and heartbreaking situation.
And then, okay, so all right, so I want to ask about the end of that, but before I do, I feel like I've gotten a good picture of what brought you here in the first place, what brought you and your wife here in the first place, and a good picture of why in those early years you stayed because of his investment.
Yes.
What kept you here over the long term? like what? You do that for 3, 4, 5, 7 years.
Yeah.
But what is it that kept you here?
Boy, I in my sense of myself did not want to stay. I had been in one career. I transitioned to another career almost by default. Awkward story, because just a quick version. The organization I was with wanted a counselor. They knew I was interested in doing a degree in counseling, so they sent me to get a master's degree in counseling so I could come back and be a counselor for them. In the process of doing that, their attorney advised against it as a liability. And so I wound up being paid this incredible salary, really good salary, to sit at a desk and do nothing. And so Dr. Huber said, well, as long as you're sitting around, why don't you come be a counselor at the church? And the background for that is there was a guy who was a psychiatrist at the church who tried to set up a counseling center, but it didn't work. And he got a better job offer, and so he left. And so it was just handed over to me as this counseling area. So right away, I wound up with about 8 people who wanted counseling like the first week, and the list grew from there. So that was something that people really liked and wanted, and so in a sense, both for him and for me, that seemed to work out very well. But it was like it was too late for him. And he was my mentor. And so it was particularly difficult for me when he said, I have to leave. I can't take this anymore. And it's too hard on my wife. I've got to go. So the only thing that anybody knew to do was to ask me to take his position. So I wound up doing that. And that, I think, as much as anything else, the act of that broke his heart, not because he didn't like me and think that was great, but because he felt he had put me in an awkward position that he had created or was unable to solve on his own. It was really just heartbreaking all the way around.
So in 1990, when he left, yes. Did he retire? Did he go?
No, he took another church.
Took another church.
Yeah,
and a part of it was just how difficult the church was on him and his wife.
That's what. Yes, it was. It grew worse and worse. It grew. Let me back up just a touch. The people who were younger began to criticize him in the church at large, and finally the board got together to say, "All right, let's hear this whole out." And there was a meeting at which I was sadly there, where they got up, several of them, and just berated him for his poor teaching, for his silly ways he talks, for his bad jokes, for his bursting into song at every occasion. Just took him apart.
But on like surface level performance evaluation type stuff?
Well, I guess you'd call it that.
I don't know. I mean, it doesn't sound like a theological disagreement.
Well, they thought that his theology was old-fashioned, but that was one amongst many complaints.
Huh.
But the main ones, I think, were that he wasn't bringing in any younger people.
Got it.
So he had to go. And the board didn't have a clue what to do with all that. They very much wanted these very people to be in the church. And so they turned, I believe, on him. And that was just a heartbreaking meeting. It was one of, I believe, 3 that where he just was raked over the coals. That I think played into his heart problems, and that's what caused him ultimately to leave, taking on the church. It was just too hard on him and his wife. So we left, and that was a blow to me. I was asked at that point to be the interim pastor. I'm running a counseling center, and so that was very strange as well.
You're like, I definitely want to step into the into the aim of all these people that just chased him.
All these telescopic sights pointed at my forehead. Yes, exactly right. And it was a very difficult couple of years. But I think, and I maintained contact with them. They were in a church in Las Vegas for a couple of years, and they moved back east. But for a couple of years there, I was able to drive over and spend some time with them, and they never recovered from that. They were just very disheartened, and just broke my heart. He's still alive, and we still correspond.
Wow. I wonder if we could talk to him. Interesting.
It would be. It
might be fun. So part of this is, the context and the culture and the structure and the political kind of, machinations of the church. What at that point, the end of the 80s, the late 80s, what was how would you describe the spiritual status of the church?
It was, well, I think I have to be careful here because part of that was I was prejudiced, having been an insider and seeing what was going on.
That's fair. Having your mentor be treated that way, it's probably hard to to evaluate that.
But I will tell you this: nobody wanted to come to this church. Nobody wanted to take this church. The reason it took so long to get someone
as a pastor,
yes, was because the word was out on this church that it's a divided church and that there's a very articulate group that is highly critical, and there are actually a lot of churches around like that. But the word was out on this church, so nobody wanted to come, and they couldn't get any candidates to apply here for the longest time, and that I think was in some sense. I was not unhappy with that. I thought, okay, we got what we deserved in some way. So that I think I had this vindictive sense that it was, I was bitter inside, and I broke my heart, and didn't know how to handle that because the criticism then fell to me. But I think the thing that really the church missed was that Dr. Huber had this wonderful, deep heart. He would call me often and just say, "How are you doing? Praying for you. What's going on there? Let me know how to pray. You're a good man. You're smart. You're doing fine. Don't worry about what they say." And those were huge encouragements to me. Huge encouragements. And there are a few people in the church who weren't in that and would tell me that they liked the way it was going and that I was holding it together and good job and all that. Yeah. But we lost people, and sadly, the wrong people. Often happens in churches. Yeah. The complainers stay, and the ones who are happy with the church leave because they're not happy anymore. So it was a tough time.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
The damage he did to the Fubers, though, I think broke my heart. They were wonderful people and still are. And he was an incredibly good teacher and preacher.
Could I'm sure there's a lot to say there, and I think it is heartbreaking in a number of ways. I think we're going to transition kind of through that interim phase, and maybe we'll pick up there and talk a little bit more about what that interim phase was like for you next time, and get into the next decade, into the 90s.
Yes.
Looking back on that time in the 80s, I think there's a lot of difficulty, a lot of heartbreak.
Yes.
I want to ask you, you were also here meeting with people, doing counseling.
Yes.
Still here as a Christian. What could you pinpoint one or two things that you saw the Lord doing during the 80s, in the midst of, and maybe in spite of, the political maneuvering among some and the heartbreak? I don't want to put you in a position where you have to say no, but I would love to. As we wrap up, is there, anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, I would say this. You can, if you're in a situation like that, and if you're listening to this, may you never be, but most of us are in some way. There's someone somewhere in that that has a good perspective on what's going on. And I didn't always look for that person, but every once in a while, somebody would say something, and I'd say, "You're what's the British phrase? You're bang on. You see it right. You correct my view. I'm too mad at these people, and I'm also mad at them because these people aren't supporting me. But you've got it right. There's a spiritual lack here of one kind, and a spiritual lack here of another kind." And then I would think about that, and I can preach on that. I can that's preachable, and if they'll listen, it might make a difference. Who knows? But at least I have a way to fight back and say something spiritual, something scriptural, something helpful that might be taken on. It helped me greatly that there were just a few people who were in that mode and were willing to just quietly and solidly confirm me in that, and it gave me the strength to fight back. And every once in a while, someone would come along who would wind up in a position of some kind of authority and use it to push, and that gave me a little more room to maneuver or to make some changes and move people around to places where they weren't so powerful or so aggravating, and bring new people in. Those kinds of changes, I think, prepared the way for the next pastor to come in. So I think even though the situation looks hopeless, I think there's this sense that I can trust that God's working behind the scenes somewhere.
Yeah.
I may not see him, but he's out doing something right now.
Yeah. I'm working through. It sounds like even just this faithful remnant that we're seeing him clearly, and that he used to, in a sense, preserve the way.
Yeah.
The way forward, and maybe prepare the way.
I would say one other thing if I can.
Yeah.
The church was stuck because the culture in it was stuck. These were the same people that had been there for decades now. New people had no way to get in. It happened that there were some people who were very tolerant of the older people, but had newer ideas that could sell those ideas, and that was another thing that amazed me, that somehow I wasn't doing anything, and I had two groups of people who were belligerently stuck in where they were and wanted to stay there. And these people came in to be a fairly significant group who, in various ways, saw the need for the church to move ahead and began to persuade these two groups, one to quiet down and the other to let go of the 1940s and let's move forward. And God worked in the background. And I didn't know it, but I saw the results of it. I think it was a tremendous lesson for me to, you're in the middle of the fire, but there's this something going on around you that God's doing. Just stay there for a minute and God will fix it. Or if not, I don't know, but that's what happened to me. And it was very encouraging, very, very encouraging. So for what it's worth.
What an interesting decade. Fascinating decade in so many different ways. The 80s.
Yeah.
We've entered into my life now. I was alive. I wasn't here, but I was. But
yet.
That's right. So, well, thanks, Jim. Thanks for your insight, your perspective. Thanks for your perseverance, and for the ways in which the Lord, has used you even in that season. I'm excited to hear a little bit more about what that interim season looked like and what the season of the 90s brought.
Yes.
In the life of the church.
Yes. How God changed the church around. This is great. Oh, I love it.
Awesome. Well, thanks. Look forward to that next time. And thank you all for listening. Thanks for being a part of this story being written.
Indeed.
Now. I love you, and we'll see you on Sunday.